I made my first million in my mid-30s and my first billion in my 50s. You know what was the difference? It wasn't that I worked 1,000 times harder in those 2 decades. It wasn't that I suddenly became 1,000 times smarter. The difference was that I finally understood the physics of the system. I stopped trying to trade my effort for currency and started positioning myself in front of a massive, inevitable shift in how the world generates value. Most people are taught to be the engine, but the engine is always the first part to wear out. The secret is to be the tracks, the infrastructure that the entire world is forced to run upon. If you are sitting there today feeling like you are falling behind, it is likely because you are still operating on a linear scale in an exponential world. You are measuring your progress by your paycheck, while the system is measuring progress by the ownership of intelligence and capital. We are currently entering a period of volatility that most people are completely unprepared for. They see the stock market reaching new highs or the rise of artificial intelligence as a spectacle to watch from the sidelines, but they don't see the underlying movement of the tide. When the tide moves at this scale, it doesn't just lift boats, it drowns those who are tied to the old docks of safety. I have watched the cycles of 1987, the dot-com bubble, and the 2008 collapse. Each time, the majority of the population was liquidated because they were holding on to the past. They believed that cash was a sanctuary, that a house was an investment, and that a degree was a shield. Today, those shields are melting. We are seeing a fundamental decoupling of productivity from human labor. If you don't understand how this new architecture is built, you are essentially betting your family's future on a game where the rules were changed while you were sleeping. This is not a warning to cause panic, but to invite a very serious form of clarity. The quiet danger of our time is not a sudden explosion, but a slow, systemic exclusion of the middle class from the assets that actually matter. If you want to understand why the rich seem to get richer while everyone else struggles to keep up with the cost of existence, you have to look past the surface. You have to look at the 5 structural secrets that the architects of the system understand but never explain. I invite you to stay with me through this entire explanation. This isn't a video about making money quickly. It's a video about how to avoid being erased by the next decade. If you find value in seeing the world through a lens of long-term cycles rather than short-term hype, you should subscribe and follow this logic to its conclusion. The reality I am about to describe is uncomfortable, but ignoring it is the most expensive mistake you will ever make. To understand the first secret, you have to understand that the world is not a collection of individual choices, but a series of overlapping systems. Most people spend their lives focused on the weather, the daily fluctuations of the stock market, the latest news cycle, or their monthly bills. But billionaires do not look at the weather. We look at the climate. We look at the deep systemic tides that determine who will be flooded and who will be lifted. If you want to understand why the old ways of building wealth are failing, you have to understand that the very nature of the system has shifted from a system of production to a system of extraction. For the last 7 years, the social contract in the West was built on a simple premise. If you were productive, you would be rewarded with a share of the growth. This was the era of the labor-based middle class. But that era ended in the late 1970s. We moved into a period of financialization, where the primary way to create wealth was no longer by making things, but by owning the debt and the assets that others used to survive. This is the first thing they won't tell you. The system is no longer designed to reward your productivity. It is designed to reward your proximity to the creation of money. When you look at a chart of productivity versus wages since 1971, you see a terrifying divergence. Workers became more efficient, technology moved faster, and the world grew wealthier, but the people doing the work stopped seeing the benefit. Where did that wealth go? It went into the assets, it went into the hands of those who understood that the currency you are paid in is a melting ice cube. If you are saving your money in a bank account, you are participating in a system that is mathematically guaranteed to dilute your purchasing power. Inflation is not an accident of the economy, it is a feature of the debt cycle. It is a silent tax that transfers wealth from those who hold cash to those who hold the debt of the world. Think about the cycle of debt. Every dollar in circulation is essentially a loan that must be paid back with interest. But where does the money to pay the interest come from? It has to be borrowed into existence. This creates a perpetual machine that requires more and more money to be printed just to keep the system from collapsing under its own weight. This is why you feel like you are running faster and faster just to stay in the same place. The cost of the things that actually matter, housing, healthcare, education, and energy, is rising much faster than the official inflation numbers suggest. Those who own the assets, the real estate, the intellectual property, the technology platforms, are the ones who capture the new money as it enters the system. Those who sell their time for cash are the ones who pay for it. I saw this clearly when we were building our early chips. I realized that the hardware wasn't just a product, it was a gatekeeper for a new kind of utility. In the history of the world, there have been several major transitions of power. We moved from land as the primary asset to industrial machinery to oil and energy. Today, we are moving into the era of compute and intelligence. This is the new land. If you don't own a piece of this infrastructure, you are effectively a tenant in a digital world. Let's look at history. In 1929, people thought the system was invincible until the leverage became too heavy for the foundation. In the 1970s, people thought inflation was a temporary nuisance until it destroyed the savings of an entire generation. In 2008, people thought housing was the safest bet in the world until they realized they were holding onto a mountain of hollow promises. Today, the system is more fragile than it has ever been because we have reached the end of the long-term debt cycle. Interest rates were held at zero for over a decade, forcing everyone to take massive risks just to get a return. This created a everything bubble where the price of assets no longer reflects their actual value, but rather the sheer volume of liquidity in the system. Billionaires understand that when the system reaches this point, the old rules of safety become the most dangerous paths you can take. Diversification is the strategy of someone who doesn't understand the system. If you diversify into 10 different assets that are all tied to the same sinking currency, you aren't safe. You are just sinking in 10 different ways. We don't diversify, we concentrate on the bottlenecks of the future. We look for the one thing that the rest of the world cannot live without, and we own the source of it. Most people are taught to fear volatility. They see a 20% drop in the market and they panic. But billionaires view volatility as the price of admission for exponential growth. The real risk is not the fluctuating price of an asset. The real risk is being stuck in an asset that is slowly being engineered out of existence. Your job, if you want to protect your family, is to identify which parts of your life are tied to the old world and which parts are tied to the new world. I want you to reflect on your own situation. If you stopped working tomorrow, how long would your assets sustain you in a world where the cost of living doubles every decade? If the answer scares you, it's because you are still a victim of the system's greatest illusion. That stability is the same thing as safety. It isn't. In a world moving this fast, stability is just a slow way to lose. If you have someone in your life who is approaching retirement or someone who is just starting their career, you should share this perspective with them. Not because it's a tip, but because they need to understand the weather is changing. The system doesn't want you to understand this. It wants you to keep believing that if you just work a little harder and save a little more, you will eventually find peace. But the numbers don't lie. The gap is widening because the mechanism of wealth has changed from working for money to owning the future. In the next part, I'm going to show you exactly how that wealth moves and why the assets you've been told are safe are actually the traps that will keep you poor for the rest of your life. Stay with me because this is where the math starts to get very real. When you look at the world's most successful people, you see a pattern that is rarely discussed in financial textbooks. Most people believe that wealth is accumulated through a steady addition of small gains. They think of it like a staircase. But in reality, wealth moves like a flood. It stays contained for a long period, and then, in a very short window of time, it moves violently from one sector of the economy to another. If you are not positioned where the flood is headed, you will spend your life trying to catch the mist it leaves behind. This is the second secret. Wealth is not earned, it is captured. To capture wealth, you must understand the difference between productivity and speculation. For the last century, human productivity was tied to human labor. If you wanted to build more cars, you hired more people. If you wanted to write more code, you hired more engineers. But we have reached a point of singularity where capital is now decoupled from labor. Today, software can write software. Intelligence can be manufactured in a data center. This means that the returns on labor are flatlining, while the returns on capital, specifically capital invested in automated intelligence, are going vertical. Most people are still trying to increase their value by learning a new skill or working more hours. They are trying to optimize their labor, but the system is currently devaluing labor at an unprecedented rate. If your income depends on you being present, you are in a high-risk position. Billionaires understand that true wealth moves toward the bottlenecks of productivity. In the industrial age, the bottleneck was oil. If you owned the oil, you owned the movement of the world. In the digital age, the bottleneck is the ability to process information at scale. This is why companies that provide the brains of the world are seeing valuations that seem irrational to the average observer. They aren't irrational, they represent the capture of all future productivity. Think about the concept of opportunity cost. This is the invisible killer of wealth. Most people look at an investment and ask, how much can I make? A billionaire looks at the world and asks, what is the cost of being wrong about where the world is going? If you stayed in cash or safe bonds over the last decade because you were afraid of a market crash, you didn't just miss a rally. You suffered a permanent loss of status. Your purchasing power relative to the assets that matter, like a home in a productive city or a stake in a dominant technology company, has been cut in half. You were safe, and yet you were destroyed. The psychology of wealth is often dictated by status anxiety. People want to look rich more than they want to be wealthy. They buy liabilities that look like assets: the luxury car, the oversized home with a massive mortgage, the expensive lifestyle that requires constant labor to maintain. These are the anchors. They keep you tied to the sinking dock I mentioned earlier. Billionaires, conversely, are often obsessed with utility. We don't want the thing, we want the thing that makes the thing. Let's look at the math of the new world. If you have $10,000 and you put it into a traditional savings account at 4% interest, you feel like you are winning. But if the real inflation rate, the rate at which the cost of high-quality life is rising, is 8%, you are losing 4% of your life every year. Over 20 years, you haven't just lost money, you've lost the ability to ever retire. Now contrast that with someone who takes that same $10,000 and places it into the infrastructure of the future. Even with the volatility, even with the 30% drops, the long-term trajectory of intelligence-based assets is tied to the exponential growth of computing power. One person is fighting the math, the other is writing it. There is a deep fear of being left behind that many people feel right now regarding AI and modern tech. That fear is your intuition telling you that the old maps are no longer accurate. The concentration of wealth we are seeing today isn't a fluke. It's the natural result of zero marginal cost. Once you build an AI model or a global platform, the cost of serving the next customer is nearly zero. This means all the profit goes to the owner of the platform. In the old world, growth was expensive. In the new world, growth is nearly free for the owners. This is the third secret. The system is tilting toward a winner take most architecture. If you are holding a diversified portfolio of average companies, you are essentially betting on the losers of this transition. I want you to stay engaged with this logic because most people turn away when it becomes uncomfortable. They want to believe that the world will return to a normal state where their savings account means something. It won't. The genie is out of the bottle. The movement of wealth is now global, digital, and instantaneous. It doesn't care about your borders, your degree, or your hard work. It only cares about where it can find the highest return on intelligence. If you have found yourself rewatching sections of this or pausing to think, that is a good sign. It means you are starting to see the invisible lines of the system. I encourage you to save this and come back to it when the noise of the daily news cycle starts to overwhelm you. You need to keep your eyes on the horizon. In the next part, I am going to challenge some of your most deeply held beliefs about what is safe. I'm going to tell you the hard truths that most people avoid until it's too late. We are going to talk about why the things you've been told to trust are the very things that are holding you back. This is perhaps the most difficult part of our conversation because to move forward, we have to dismantle the illusions you've been taught to lean on. Most people live their lives based on a set of financial myths that act as a psychological security blanket. They feel warm, they feel safe, but they offer no actual protection from the cold reality of the system. If you want to survive the shifts I've described, you have to be willing to look at these myths and see them for what they are: boats tied to a sinking dock. The fourth secret is that safety is an illusion sold to the middle class to ensure they remain a source of liquidity for the system. Let's start with the most dangerous myth of all, the safety of cash. People think that by holding currency in a bank, they are avoiding risk. But cash is not a store of value. It is a medium of exchange that is being systematically devalued. When you hold cash, you are essentially granting a zero interest loan to the government and the banks so they can invest in the very assets that are making you poorer. In a debt-based system, the only way to pay off the old debt is to create new money, which means the cash in your pocket is designed to lose. It is an insurance policy where the premiums cost more than the payout. Then there is the myth of blind diversification. You've been told to spread your risk across hundreds of different stocks and bonds. But in a globalized, highly correlated economy, diversification often becomes diworsification. When a real systemic crisis hits, the correlation of all traditional assets goes to one. Everything drops together. The only thing that diversification accomplishes in a bull market is ensuring that you never have enough of a stake in the winners to actually change your life. Billionaires don't diversify to build wealth, they concentrate. They find the one thing they understand better than anyone else, the one bottleneck, the one technology, the one piece of land, and they bet heavily on it. Diversification is for people who want to preserve what they already have. Concentration is for people who want to change their status. We also need to talk about the myth of timing the market. Most people spend their emotional energy trying to buy at the bottom and sell at the top. They treat the economy like a casino. But wealth isn't made by timing, it's made by time in the right position. I didn't build my company by trying to guess when the next recession would hit. I built it by realizing that the demand for computing power would be infinite and staying in that position for 30 years. The people who tried to time our stock based on quarterly news missed the thousand-fold growth that happened in the quiet years. If you are waiting for the perfect time to act, you are already losing to those who are simply willing to endure the volatility. One of the hardest truths to swallow is that your degree and your professional title are becoming depreciating assets. We are entering an era where the half-life of knowledge is shrinking. What you learned 5 years ago is likely obsolete today. If your primary asset is your ability to perform a specific task that can be codified into an algorithm, you are in a race to the bottom. The system is no longer paying for what you know. It is paying for your ability to direct the machines that do. This is a brutal realization for those who have spent decades climbing a corporate ladder, only to find the ladder is leaning against a wall that is being torn down. You must also face the reality that the government is not your retirement plan. Whether you are in the US, the UK, or Australia, the demographic math is working against you. There are fewer workers supporting more retirees, and the promises made decades ago are becoming mathematically impossible to keep. Relying on the state for your ultimate safety is like trusting a captain who has already told you the lifeboats are full. You have to be your own central bank. You have to take personal responsibility for your sovereignty. This leads to a very uncomfortable question. What are you willing to give up to be safe? Most people are not willing to give up their short-term comfort. They aren't willing to endure the social friction of being different or the psychological pain of being wrong for a while. They would rather be wrong with the crowd than right by themselves. But the crowd is currently being led toward a cliff of systemic irrelevance. I want you to take a moment and conduct an honest self-assessment. Look at your balance sheet, not just your money, but your time and your skills. How much of it is tied to the old world of labor and debt? How much of it is positioned to capture the value of the new world of intelligence and capital? If you are still heavily weighted toward the old world, you aren't safe. You are just waiting for the inevitable. Stay with me for the final part. We are going to move past the warnings and toward the long view. I'm going to show you how to frame the future so you can move from a state of quiet panic to a state of calm, decisive action. This is the moment where you decide if you want to remain a spectator or if you are ready to understand the system well enough to navigate it. We have reached the point where the path divides. You now understand that the system is not a neutral landscape, it is a moving current. You understand that the secrets billionaires hold are not hidden in vaults, but are simply the laws of economic physics that most people choose to ignore because they are too heavy to carry. The final secret, the one that ties everything together, is that wealth is ultimately the ability to control your own time in an era that wants to commoditize it. The world is currently dividing into two distinct groups. There are those who will be consumed by the complexity of the future and those who will be the architects of it. The decision you have to make today is not which stock to buy or which trend to chase. The decision is about your fundamental orientation toward the future. Are you going to continue seeking shelter in the structures of the past, the cash, the linear career, the blind diversification? Or are you going to accept the reality that the only true security comes from being indispensable to the new world? I want you to look at the next decade with a sense of calm, not panic. Panic is the enemy of strategy. When people panic, they make short-term decisions that destroy long-term wealth. They sell at the bottom, they buy the hype at the top, and they let their emotions dictate their positioning. But when you understand the long cycle, you realize that volatility is just the system repricing itself. It is the noise of the old world being replaced by the new. If you are positioned correctly, the noise doesn't matter. Think about the concept of the long view. In the short term, the world is a mess. It is full of political theater, social unrest, and economic friction. But in the long term, the trajectory of human progress is driven by one thing: the increase in our ability to process and utilize intelligence. This has been true since the invention of the printing press, and it is exponentially more true today. If you align yourself with that trajectory, time becomes your greatest ally. If you fight it, time becomes your executioner. Most people will finish this video and go back to their lives. They will feel a temporary spark of clarity, but the gravity of their daily routines will eventually pull them back into the safety of the sinking dock. They will wait for the news to tell them when it's safe to act. They will wait for the government to fix the inflation. They will wait for a sign that the world is back to normal. But I am telling you, there is no normal to return to. We are moving into a future that is more concentrated, more automated, and more competitive than anything we have seen before. The choice is yours. You can choose awareness or you can choose ignorance. Awareness is painful. It requires you to admit that the path you've been on might be leading you to a dead end. It requires you to endure the discomfort of learning a new language of value. But awareness also gives you the one thing that the system cannot take away: a map. When you have a map, you don't fear the storm, you simply navigate through it. I didn't build $1 billion company by being the luckiest man in the room. I built it by being the most patient man in the room. I was willing to be wrong for years so that I could be right for decades. I was willing to ignore the safe advice of those who couldn't see past the next quarter. You must develop that same level of conviction. You must stop looking for the exit and start looking for the entry into the infrastructure of the future. This is a quiet, dignified call to action. I am not asking you to buy a course or join a scheme. I am asking you to change your mind. I am asking you to subscribe to a way of thinking that prioritizes clarity over comfort. If you want to understand the system as it evolves, stay informed with us. Don't chase the trends. Understand the cycles. The wealth of the next decade will not be found in the pockets of those who work the hardest, but in the hands of those who see the world most clearly. The window is still open, but the frame is narrowing. The world does not care if you are ready. The math does not care if you feel it's fair. The system simply moves. I suggest you move with it.